First scenario, adding a new class to our model. So back to Visual Studio, I'm going to create a new class called category. I want to assign each course to a category, like web development, mobile development, programming languages, and so on. So let's create a new class. And call it category. First, we need to make it public, so it's accessible. Next, we need to give it a property that uniquely represents a category object, like a primary key. Now, in terms of naming, we have two choices here. We can use the word ID or the name of the class plus ID, like category ID. These are the conventions that Entity Framework understands out of the box. If you want to use a property as your primary key that does not follow this convention, you can always override the conventions. But that's something that I'm going to show you later in this section. So for now, let's just keep it simple. So here's the ID property. Let's create another property like name. Now I have two choices. I can go ahead and add a migration that creates the categories table, or I can continue modifying my model by adding a property of type category to the course class. Then when I create a migration, that migration will create both the categories table and add the category column to the courses table. Based on my experience, it's much better and safer to work with small changes. So I'm going to add a migration that will create the categories table. So add migration. Now here we need to give it a name. We have two choices here. We can use a model-centric name or a database-centric name. A model-centric name is like add category, whereas a database-centric name is like add categories table. Which one is better? I personally started with model-centric names, but with experience, I realized that database-centric names are a bit better because sometimes your migrations are purely for modifying database objects that do not have a representation in your model. For example, you might want to create a trigger or modify an index or a stored procedure or a view. These objects do not have a representation in your model. They're purely database objects. So let's give it a database-centric name. Add categories table. Okay, let's take a look at the migration. Look, it's empty. Why is that? Because this class is not discoverable. We simply created this class in our application, but nowhere we have referenced this, so Entity Framework cannot find it. So how can we make this class discoverable? We need to add it to our DB context. So let's go to this Pluto context here. Look, we've got 3 DB sets here: authors, courses, and tags. So we need to introduce categories here. Okay, now we need to recreate our migration. So back to Package Manager console. I'm going to use the up cursor to remember the last command, but because we already have a migration by that name, we need to use the force switch. So Entity Framework will overwrite this migration. Okay, beautiful. Let's take a look at the migration here. So this migration creates a new table called categories with 2 columns, ID and name. And ID is going to be the primary key. Now, we probably need to populate this table with some data. How do we do that? I'm going to show you a very powerful tool in Codeforce migrations, the SQL method. With this method, you can run any SQL statements on your database. And that's why I told you at the beginning of the course that with Codeforce Workflow, you have full control over your database. You can run any statements here. So in this case, I'm going to use this method to populate the categories table with some data. So here we need to specify column names. I'm going to use the name column only because the ID column by convention is an identity column. If you want to override this convention, simply go here, change identity to false. And now we need to specify both ID and name for each category. So I can shortcut the SQL statement and just use one and web development. Now we duplicate this line. Another category. And use a different ID. Beautiful. Now back to Package Manager console and update the database. Perfect. Let's take a look at the database. So refresh. Look, we got the categories table. And here are two categories. Now the next step is to modify the course class and add a category property there. So I'm going to clean up my workspace and open up the course class. So this is the auto-generated code from reverse engineering our existing database. I'm going to add a new property here of type category and call it category. So a small change and a small migration. So back to Package Manager console, add migration. We give it a database-centric name, add category column to courses table. Let's take a look at the migration. So look, here we create a new column in the courses table called category underline ID. Again, this is the convention. If you don't like the underline here, you can always override the convention. And I will show you all of this later in this section. The type of this column is going to be an integer. Next here, we create an index on this column because it's very likely that we would like to look up courses by a given category. And finally, here we create a foreign key on the courses table, the category ID column that points to the categories table, the ID column. Now here again, we can use our SQL method to automatically populate the categories for existing courses, if it makes sense. For example, I can come here and type SQL update courses set category underline ID equals 1. I can automatically assign all courses to web development, if it makes sense. What I'm trying to show you here is that you have full control over your database. Now let's run this migration. Update database. Beautiful. Let's go to SQL Server and look at the courses table. Well, currently we don't have any records here, but if we did, all these records will have the category ID 1. Now I'm going to manually insert a record here. So in the next migration, where I'm going to show you a different scenario, you can see the impact of migrations on your data. So let's call this course 1, description 1, level 1, full price 10, author ID 1, course category ID 1. This error is because our authors table is empty. So the value of 1 I used here is not acceptable. So let me go to the authors table. Create an author. Okay, now back to the courses. Beautiful. Okay, now that we have a course record, let's take a look at another scenario.